My dick is bigger than your dick. We take more dicks than a touring funk band. Sing it. Greetings, everybody. It is I, obviously Jesus, here once again with another video. This, I believe, is the fourth and final Patreon video for the month of August 2017. Let's get right into it because my camera is doing a thing that my old camera used to do and shutting down randomly, and I can't see the little light from here to know whether or not it's still recording. So I'm just going to try to get through this as concisely as possible. I have some notes here. As I said, I'm going to try to keep things more structured in my videos to prevent me from going in circles and just, masturbating myself on camera, basically, intellectually speaking. But anyway, I'm obviously Jesus, and today we are going to talk about the flaws of libertarianism. This video was requested by Tyler Wagner, or Wagner, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, but in any event, let's get going and talking about the flaws of libertarianism, of which there are many. But I will, of course, try to balance it out at the end by talking about some of the things that libertarianism, I think, still gets right, or at least partially gets right. But anyway, let's move on to the biggest, the elephant in the room, so to speak, when it comes to libertarianism. And this is what ultimately turned me away from libertarianism. I used to, if you don't know, if you don't remember my old videos, or if you didn't watch them, I used to really identify as a libertarian. I've been turned away from it by a lot of these points here that I'm going to discuss. But just for a little bit of personal background, know that I do not do this as some kind of casual dismissal of a philosophy. I wouldn't do that. I'm not the type of person, I think, who wants to reject an idea just because it doesn't fit with my worldview. Fact of the matter is here, libertarianism definitely did fit with my worldview from about age, I'd say about age 17 or 18 through to about age 20 or 21. So, there was a period of my life wherein I considered myself a libertarianism, or I considered myself a libertarianism. Yes, that's what I considered myself. I made that mistake twice. I edited it out before, but I'm not going to do it this time because it's just too fucking ridiculous. But I did consider myself a libertarian. I did, I like the fact that there were politicians out there like Ron Paul, and to a lesser extent his son Rand, who fought big government influence. But I'll talk about some of these things that sort of led me away from this philosophy, because at the end of the day, and this is my first point, libertarianism is just too much of a utopian type of philosophy. Basically, libertarianism relies on too many things going right at all times. It's very much a philosophy for a perfect world. Big glaring error here. Libertarianism really doesn't account for people who have, sicknesses or, disabilities, or, even just a relative lack of motivation. Libertarianism does not work if there are people out there who cannot or will not, for whatever reason, contribute equally to a society. People have to be motivated. They have to have, the ability to work in a libertarian society, because the whole idea of a libertarian society is that everybody works, everybody, contributes to, their local communities. It's very much about, decentralization of power. And everybody, gives, they bring something to the table and they receive stuff in return, basically. It's a free market capitalist society where all the good ideas get rewarded, and basically everybody who deserves to be on top gravitates to the top, and everybody who, doesn't just sort of gets stuck at the bottom, basically. But libertarianism obviously is not really focused on the people at the bottom. It's more a philosophy for people who feel like they have, upward mobility, basically. But not everybody has upward mobility. People, like I said, can be sick, they can be disabled, they can have a lack of motivation for one of many reasons, be it environmental or, a brain condition or something. Basically, my main criticism here is that not everybody is going to have an equally valuable creative outlet to contribute to this laissez-faire capitalist system. Therefore, some people inevitably are going to be left in the dirt. And libertarianism doesn't really account for what happens to those people, because libertarianism inherently believes, I think, that people who aren't succeeding just didn't deserve to, and that's not always the case. It's such a blanket, ridiculous statement to say that, life sorts people out to exactly where they want to be, when there's idiots like Donald Trump who are obscenely rich and there's, you know, smart people who labor in obscurity. You know, so it's ridiculous to me to think that libertarianism is, you know, applicable to the world, not just for this reason, but also because libertarianism doesn't even speak about undoing current racial power structures. Especially in the United States, there is a big stratification where it's generally white people who are middle class and rich, and minorities, you know, are overwhelmingly poor in most areas. There are some exceptions, of course. There are some places where those numbers differ, but there's a lot of people, especially minorities, living in poverty. Of course, there are white people living in poverty as well. I don't want to diminish them and minimize them, but you have to acknowledge, just look at any statistics, there is rather a big wage gap between not only men and women, but between, you know, white people generally and minorities. And libertarianism doesn't, I don't even know how you would begin to even institute libertarianism, to be completely honest, in the United States, if like Ron Paul had won an election, or if Rand Paul won an election or something, because libertarianism is basically, in order for it to even have a chance of working, and you know, there are no examples, there are no real world examples of libertarianism. I don't think that condemns the philosophy itself, but you know, we'd have to basically chart new territory if we were to do that as a country. And I think it would fail if there weren't just one big reset of all, you know, societal, you know, balance. If everybody started from the same place, then maybe libertarianism would work, but that itself would require a very unlibertarian distribution of wealth and restructuring of current power structures in the United States, because in order to implement libertarianism and give everybody a fair shot, you have to undo centuries, literal centuries of racial biases that have kept people of minority you know, origin ghettoized and given them less opportunities. You'd have to undo the entire system of white privilege before you could even begin to apply libertarianism as a philosophy, because the only way that laissez-faire capitalism can truly sort out who is deserving and who is not deserving is if literally everybody starts with the same amount of resources and starts at the same amount of, or starts with the same amount of opportunity, basically. If everybody can start from zero and there's no racial prejudices and there's no you know, economic prejudices, and you know, people can't just hoard land and you know, resources and property, if everybody started from there where everybody was relatively equal, then okay, maybe we could give a libertarian society a shot, but we are so far from that. We are so ridiculously far from that in the United States that we would have to do so many unlibertarian things to get to, you know, unraveling all these centuries of prejudice and ghettoization and all these other barriers that have kept mostly minorities, but you know, all poor people in general down. We would have to undo all these systems, so it's so impractical and so, you know, against itself in a way that I don't think we will ever see a libertarian society, or a truly, you know, equal libertarian society where everybody, you know, starts with the same opportunity and just competes to see who's most deserving, ever be able to be implemented here in this country. And again, that doesn't even take into account the fact that you can't still account in a libertarian system for people who need something like government benefits to treat their sickness or disease or something. So libertarianism is far too utopian, far too impractical to ever implement on, you know, the scale of a country. I could see maybe smaller groups doing it, maybe a municipality, but I do not think that, especially here in the United States, that will ever be actualized in any real way that would be consistent with libertarian philosophy. You could maybe have some sort of bastardized form of libertarianism that, you know, retains all these imbalanced power structures where, you know, the 1% owns so much money and the, you know, the poorest people own so very little of the wealth in terms of the country. But you will never, you know, you can't just port our current democracy over to libertarianism and have it work, because there's so much imbalance ingrained in that system that even enacting a libertarian society immediately right now, you would just have the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. It wouldn't change anything, because the rich, despite being, generally speaking, undeserving, they would have enough resources if we went libertarian today to keep themselves at the top of the food chain, perhaps, perpetually and perhaps indefinitely. So I don't think we will ever see that. We certainly can't do it from the point we're at now, and that's one of the big things that I think libertarianism fails to account for, but we'll talk about some more stuff as well. And again, before we move off this topic, I just want to say that laissez-faire capitalism isn't necessarily the best way to achieve the best results and avoid pain for the most people. If I want to do something with this channel and these videos on my comeback, I want to have a consistent philosophy that centers around avoiding pain. And so in order to do that, we have to look at whether or not, if we even were able to institute a libertarian system of society, would that avoid pain for people? Would we still be able to, take care of the people who, for whatever reason, couldn't make it in laissez-faire capitalism? But also, is laissez-faire capitalism even necessarily the best way to achieve your, desired results, where the most deserving people wind up on top and the least deserving wind up on the bottom? I mean, if you look at our track record here in terms of laissez-faire capitalism, for every success story where you see, an article or a think piece online about someone with a good idea, being rewarded by capitalism for their good idea, you often see, counter arguments out there as well. I mean, you could say, I will give it to you, that there's things like the crash of 2008, which was instituted by, an over-regulated market, not allowing banks to fail when they should have failed. But there's also counter-arguments to say that, laissez-faire capitalism produces things like monopolies historically. When left to their own devices, a monopoly is going to be very, very good for the few people on top while denying choice and competition to the people at the bottom. And monopolies are a big example of how a laissez-faire capitalist system can turn on itself and become, it becomes the thing that it was desired not to be. Because no libertarian wants a market devoid of competition. But if you don't regulate people, if you don't regulate against monopolies, then ultimately, in some industries at least, that's what happens. I believe it happened with the phone companies a while back. I'm not sure what decade that happened in, but they had to split up AT&T and Bell and a lot of companies like that because there was a monopoly. So a libertarian system, would say, oh, you can't split up this monopoly, but, it's antithetical to itself, because libertarians realize and acknowledge as part of their own philosophy that more competition makes for a better market. So if you don't have regulations to ensure, at least the most basic regulations to ensure the most optimal market where there still can be competition and things don't get dominated by monopolies, then you're sort of giving in to becoming what you hate. And if you can't guard against what you hate, then what good is your philosophy? If your philosophy doesn't contain provisions for guarding against the thing that you supposedly despise, then you're really no better than the thing you despise, aren't you? I mean, that's how it seems to me. I'm not saying that the market needs to be completely regulated, that we need to go full communist and nationalize everything, although I think that would work in some things like healthcare. And I think that, examples of bad government interference are abound as well, like like I mentioned, the crash of 2008, where the banks were simply too big to fail and we had to prop them up and bail out the rich people, and that's not a very good thing either. So I do think it's totally possible to have something that isn't one of the two extremes. You don't have to have monopolies running rampant, and you don't have to have the government propping up bad businesses that are too big to fail. I do think that theoretically we can have a sweet spot. I don't know that the people elected to the presidency or to Congress will ever give us that sweet spot, but I think that theoretically, at least, it is possible with a modicum of regulation to bring us into some kind of equilibrium. And I don't think libertarianism accounts for that any more than full nationalization of everything fails to account for certain things that libertarians criticize them for as well. So I think the answer does lie in the middle. Now let's talk about one of the big points of libertarianism as we know it, especially here in the United States, and that is the notion that taxation is theft. But the thing is, it's Really not, in a sense. Taxation is simply predicated on the fact that all of us, all human beings, use certain goods and services provided by the government. Most notably, we all travel on the same roads that are paved by local, state, and federal governments, depending on where they run to. So the idea that taxation is theft when you use, some degree of government stuff every day just by living, and you benefit, in all these passive ways from the existence of governments and whatnot, and you're not paying tolls crossing from state to state and everything. That's all because of the government. That's all because we all share in and live in a common space, whether that be a municipality, a state, or an entire nation. But let's say I can't convince you with the argument that we all use the same basic goods and services to some extent. Let's say I can't convince you with that argument, and it has to come down to something else. That you have to acknowledge that taxation is a form of force and coercion. Let's say that I can't convince you and we have to argue on that point. I would say that when it comes to avoiding pain and making sure people are not struggling simply to survive, it's better to take some money off the people who have tons of it than it is to literally say that poor people, sick people, disabled people should, fend for themselves and risk literal death because rich people cannot part with a little bit of their money. Honestly, that's what it comes down to. I've talked a lot about in my videos, like I said before in this video, avoiding pain. People don't choose to be born. People shouldn't have to suffer because their parents made the mistake of conceiving a child. People shouldn't have to suffer simply because they are born into an economic situation where their parents can't support them, and then their parents die or they aren't present, and then they're struggling with psychological or physical, sicknesses and disabilities. People shouldn't have to suffer and die and be left to their own devices. That's simply where I just bumped my mic, sorry. That's where I draw the line in the sand, honestly, personally speaking. I cannot condemn people to fend for themselves and live and die. I do not believe, at least not anymore, in that kind of social Darwinism, because the blame does not rest on the individual people who are suffering themselves. They didn't ask to be born. They didn't ask to put themselves in these shitty economic situations that stupid parents have kids into all the time, every day. So if it comes down to it, and it does, because it comes down to a choice. It comes down to the choice of whether or not we leave those people to suffer, fend for themselves, and die, or do we take some money off of people who already have loads of it as part of a social contract that expects people to help according to their ability to help, even if that requires the use of government coercion through the form of tax laws. Honestly, and I never used to, but I think that the humane thing to do is to say, we can take a little bit from people who have a lot and give it to people who don't. And that's the side I come down on, simply because it avoids pain for people. I'm not saying people need to be living large and having like the greatest standard of living. I'm not saying everybody needs to be completely equal. Like I said, I'm not advocating going full communist where everybody is equal and there's like a complete cap and whatnot. But I think that tax laws can, penalize in terms of taxes rich people more than poor people, because it doesn't make sense that people should suffer based on the economic situation that they were born into. It's literally a system wherein something's gotta give. And I think that the most sensible thing to give is the rich people, because there is very few of them, and they won't miss what we would, advocate taking off of them, in any way. So it's not going to impede their ability to function. And all I'm saying is that we basically give people who are poor, disabled, etc., enough money that their basic day-to-day life is not impeded by, lack of food or lack of health care. That's literally the baseline that I want to set. and I'm okay with redistribution of wealth up until that point. And it's a very hard thing. I'm talking in very general terms. I'm not saying that this balancing act of figuring out where that line is, where they're not being impeded anymore and they're not taking too much off rich people. I'm not saying I know precisely where that line is, but I know there needs to be a line, basically. And let's talk for a second about the favorite thing that libertarians tout when they talk about their philosophy, which is the non-aggression principle. The idea that nobody should use force against anybody else, whether that be a state entity against a person against a state entity, or a person against a person, or states against states. This is the core value of libertarianism here. And it's one of my favorite things about libertarianism, honestly, the idea that nobody has the right, be they government or not government, to interfere with you if you're doing something that doesn't interfere with anybody else but yourself. So you could say, for example, do drugs if you weren't, driving and risking the health of other people. If you weren't, harming anybody in any way, you can basically do whatever the hell you want. The non-aggression principle is, I believe, basically the saving grace of libertarianism, and people use it to say, oh, well, you can't tax people because taxation is a use of force. Taxation is theft. Comes from this non-aggression principle idea that the government doesn't have the right to basically use their laws to reach into your pockets and take your money unless you consent to give it to them. But here's the thing, and this is an idea that I've become more enamored with as time goes on, more and more, and it's the idea that isn't a system that allows there to be billionaires who are obscenely wealthy, while at the same time there are people who are literally struggling and in pain to survive due to lack of resources. Isn't that system inherently violating the non-aggression principle because the billionaires are actively being aggressive in hoarding so much land, property, or wealth that it creates a vacuum in the poorest among us where those people don't have access to services? It's something to think about, definitely. And there's another idea similar to this that comes from a guy named Jeffrey Friedman, and he says opposing slavery basically means you're putting human rights over property rights, in the sense that you're putting human rights of equality over the supposed legal written rights of people to own other people as property. So why should we also not oppose people hoarding large amounts of non-human property to the detriment of other people? I'm not sure I get behind this specific stance 100% because I think that owning another human being as property is inherently never acceptable, and it's not, no matter who writes it down, something that we can tolerate in terms of human rights. I don't think it's really comparable between owning human property and owning non-human property, but I think they're just so far gone that you can't ever compare them. You can see owning property, like non-human property, as a legitimate thing, but I don't think you can ever legitimize owning human property. But anyway, it's not something I get behind 100%, like I said, but in a general sense, you can see how the logic is there, where there comes a point at which you have to put human rights and basic survival and basic dignity of people over the strict rights to own property. And even when we're talking about strictly non-human property, that is something that I can get behind. All right, now let's talk about the final thing I'm going to talk about in this video, which is the problem of delegation, and it's a big one. Basically, delegation in terms of decentralization, because libertarianism wants the federal government to have as little interest, or as little influence rather, as possible over the affairs of states, and states to have as little affairs as necessary over the affairs of municipalities. So they want to decentralize the power structure and let each state or city decide for themselves, rather than having a blanket type of deal where the federal government passes laws down to states and municipalities that are all affected by them. But this is a problem. On the surface, the thing that used to be attractive to me about this, at least, was the idea that every state could create their own culture, every state could create their own set of values. But the problem here is, and this is one of the earliest things I recognized was a flaw in libertarianism, one of the earliest things that I recognized was, what if one state wants to do something completely and totally absurd? What if, let's say in one state they decide to make abortion a crime, punishable by, years and years in prison or death. Let's say that that is something that one state wants to do. According to libertarians, a federal government can step in and say, or they can't step in and say, oh, well, this is terrible. You're killing people who simply want a medical procedure that is, within the realms of, human rights and, having control and autonomy over your own body. But in a libertarian system, the states can say that, oh, you're the federal government, you don't have power over me. If libertarianism were implemented, the federal government would not be able to step in and stop problematic policies or outright atrocities on the state level because their power will have been stripped. So that's the problem. When policy made by the states becomes oppressive, and I would say that any policy that made abortion illegal and denied people control over their own bodies is anti-libertarian, and I bet a lot of libertarians would say the same as well. But let's just take it to its logical conclusion. Let's say something so horrible happened in a libertarian society. The federal government, no higher power would be able to step in and stop these atrocities. And even let's take it something that's more real and more recent, voting rights. A lot of states have different voting rights requirements, and a lot of these voting rights laws are being actively used to disenfranchise the poor and minority people who would vote for non-Republican candidates. And this is documented. This isn't something that's an opinion or up for debate. You can look at it up. People actively use voting rights laws in different states to suppress voter turnout of people they don't want voting. Mostly it's from Republicans doing this to Democrats, although I'm sure it does happen in reverse every now and then. But let's say that these voting rights laws are problematic because they disenfranchise people. In this country, we're supposed to have the value of every single person getting the right to vote. And I don't necessarily trust democracy. I don't trust the people who are up for election, but let's say everybody wants to vote. You can't use these laws to disenfranchise people. But because the states decide the voting laws and not the federal government, there's no way to standardize these voting laws and make them more fair and less oppressive. So, this is a problem, honestly. This is a point, I believe, at which a benevolent federal government, which I know seems absurd to say, but there are people theoretically out there who would be in favor of standardizing national voting laws to make sure that nobody gets left out in the cold, nobody gets, disenfranchised by a law designed to target, the poorest minorities among us who would typically support, more democratic candidates. This happens. People have admitted to it. It's very, very well documented that these voter fraud laws are used in that way. So to have a federal government come in and standardize these things and make sure that they're not used in that way anymore, I think would be an example of a time when a federal government stepping in can be a positive thing. Because passing the buck, passing the oppression from the federal level down to the state level and saying, oh, we're the federal government, we wash our hands of it, it's not our problem, it's the state's problem, or a state government saying, oh, it's up to the municipalities, it's the municipalities' problem. That, I think, is what constitutes an act of moral cowardice. If all you do is send it down the chain and say, oh, well, one state wants to reinstitute slavery, I can't do anything about it, it's the federal government, we don't have that power, where does it end? Where does it end? Honestly, if we can't have the federal government institute the most basic guards in all states against any kind of oppression, then what good is living in this country? What good is electing people at a federal level at all if they would be powerless to do anything? And I think we have to have a standard. We have to draw a line when it comes to certain types of crimes. If one thing is a crime in a state and it's not a crime in the state next to it, that might work for some things, but if it comes to murder, if it comes to severe things, then, where does it end? if we don't have some kind of baseline where we say no to forms of oppression, where we say no to violent criminals across all states, given to us by a federal government, then where does it end? I think people would, manipulate smaller governments to be more suitable to them. And you see it with the voting rights laws. You see it with abortion laws here in the United States. Look what's happened with abortions in the United States. We have Roe v. Wade on a federal level, but states get to decide, in their own senses, how many they get to decide their own, Planned Parenthood funding and whatnot. And that has led to a situation where there are very, very large states with very, very few abortion clinics. And so, especially for the poorest people, the people who probably shouldn't be having children, the people who can't afford these medical procedures, for the people who need it most, let's say a state like Texas, I believe there's like 1 or 2 abortion clinics in the state of Texas. Libertarians are fond of saying, oh, if you don't like the policies in your state, just go to another state. But when it comes to very poor people in very large states, that doesn't work. It's not feasible. Libertarianism absolutely leaves people out in the cold if we don't have some kind of overriding universal, guidelines as to what rights people have and what things people can and cannot do when it comes to the most extreme cases. So we have to have federal laws. We have to have federal guards against oppression. You cannot just pass the buck down from state to city and such and say, oh, well, it's not my problem. I don't have the rights to handle this. The federal government could and should step in certain cases when it comes to human rights being violated. And that comes to, making sure, health procedures are available to the poorest people who can't afford it. It comes down to, making sure that people have access to, abortions. And it comes down to making sure that people aren't being harmed and interfered with in their own homes. And, the federal government has its place. It doesn't have to be omnipresent. It doesn't have to regulate every aspect of our lives, but it absolutely should guard against oppression. If we can't do that, then there's no point to a federal government at all. And I'm not there yet. I believe that the federal government, with the right people in power, can be used to guard against oppression in this way. But like I said at the beginning of the video, I still believe there's some good aspects to libertarianism, specifically the non-aggression principle. When it comes to things like drug laws and the death penalty, it's very much still something that I believe in. I don't believe the state has the right, or the state being the government of any state or federal level, has the right to kill other people when it expects people who are subject to its laws to not kill people. I think that the state should not sanction killing in any way, shape, or form. That also informs my views on foreign policy and being a non-interventionalist and saying that people need to deal with their own problems. I mean, look what's happened with our constant intervention in the Middle East. It's been happening since, I believe, the 50s in Iran, or at least the 70s. I forget which decade the hostage crisis was in. But honestly, our foreign policy has been terrible and could most certainly benefit from a more libertarian-like application of the non-aggression principle. And I don't think that people who do things that only affect themselves, regardless of how legal or illegal they are, should be subject to the government's purview and judgment and justice if they aren't doing anything that interferes with other people. Also, one thing I forgot to mention earlier, when it comes to capitalism, libertarianism does not necessarily provide safeguards for the environment. I mean, look where capitalism has got us so far. We haven't adopted solar panels and other alternative forms of energy at nearly the rate we need to in order to stop the pollution of this planet. And the pollution of this planet is like the right to health care and the right to not be interfered with is something that I believe should be a human right. We have to have a planet to live on unless we're developing spacecraft, which we also aren't. So, capitalism isn't necessarily leading us to alternative energies or to, spacefaring technology, one of which we need to survive. It's not leading us there nearly as fast as it should, and I believe that in order to save, the planet for future generations, that I'm not going to have, of course, but even just as a principle, I think we need government intervention on that as well. But again, back to the good things that I like about libertarianism. There's a non-aggression principle, which I already talked about, and then there's the idea of private property. And I'm not a full communist. I don't believe that, you know, the abolition of private property is going to gain anything. We all experience life as individuals. We all experience the world through one pair of eyes. We're not a unified consciousness. Everybody has different needs and different, you know, wants and things. So to have private property, I believe, is essential to any society, because to have it completely abolished is completely absurd. And I don't think there's like any country that lives like that either. There's no country that practices, you know, no private property, and there's no country that practices full libertarianism. So I think that because of those two things, when you look at them combined, you have to acknowledge that, you know, the truth, I believe, lies somewhere in the middle. And you know, allowing people to own and defend their property within reason, without hoarding it to the detriment of other people, is completely fine. So I'm not for abolishing private property. I believe private property rights are intrinsically valuable to a world which we all experience as individuals. So anyway, I'm obviously Jesus. Those are my thoughts on the flaws and the not so flawed aspects of libertarianism. Hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you next week. Thank you to all my Patreon people, as always. Thank you to Tyler, who submitted this question, or topic, I guess you'd call it. But anyway, see you next time.